Well, hello and welcome to the fourth and maybe fifth, depending on how long this goes, installment of our long extended series looking at Jonathan Edwards' philosophy of beauty and some of the implications of that for life and for reality. Today I am over in the church. So normally you see me do this in my office, but I decided to come over to this church building, which is the church that I preach at on the weekends. And it is, you can't see, but my house is just a few yards that way. So I just brought some stuff over here and set this up. And I thought, since this is going to be a longer presentation, it's really more like giving a talk than just, kind of sitting in my office. So I wanted to come and have this and have my iPad here. And I am going to be referring to my iPad and to my notes because there's a lot here and there's a lot of things that I want to be as clear as I can about. So I wrote them down and I'm going to unabashedly refer to and sometimes read from these notes. So this is more like the presentation at a conference or something. But anyway, this is the way I thought would work best. So it's going to be a long one. I may break it into two parts, but it's going to be extended. So let's just begin. If you've been following this series, then you saw that first we looked at this idea of beauty at all for Jonathan Edwards is, we said, a relational concept, which means it deals with a relationship between two or more things. And simple beauty is just concerned about the relationship between two or more things in agreement. So if there's two things that consent or agree, then there's a degree of simple beauty there. Two circles has a higher degree of simple beauty than a circle and a triangle, because for two circles there's more consent than if you have a circle and a triangle. I know that sounds very simple, but that's why it's called simple beauty. And then we talked about complex beauty. And complex beauty is where it begins to bring in overarching patterns. And so it's the relationship, still the relationship between two or more entities, but how they relate to the overall pattern of which they're a part. And you can go back and look at the complex beauty video. I won't get into it now. But we said that complex beauty then has two subcategories that kind of are created by this concept of complex beauty. You've got two subcategories that come from that, and they would be disfigured beauty, which is actually disfigurement. It's actually something that's broken or ugly, but it's disfigured beauty. And then beautiful disfigurement, which is actually beautiful, even though it looks disfigured or broken. So we looked last time at this idea of disfigured beauty, which is where something seems to be beautiful. When you consider it narrowly, it seems to be beautiful. But when you pull out and look at it in light of the larger pattern, you realize it's actually dissenting. It's actually disfigured is the term we're using. And you can go back and look at that, the last video in the series, for more about that idea of disfigured beauty. We call it disfigured beauty because it looks like beauty up close, but when you zoom out, you realize it's disfigured, it's broken, it's dissenting, it doesn't agree with the overall pattern. But then today, what we're going to be looking at is this idea of beautiful disfigurement. And beautiful disfigurement is the opposite of disfigured beauty. Beautiful disfigurement is something that when you look at it narrowly up close, it looks disfigured. It looks dissenting and broken. But when you zoom out and look at it in light of the larger pattern, you realize that it is actually beauty. It's actually an instance of beauty. And that's what I want to look at with you today. So first, two really simple examples to get this idea of beautiful disfigurement in our minds. The first one is this. We've seen this picture a number of times before during this series, but here it is again. So from this narrow viewing angle, the red X seems to be an instance of disfigurement. It looks like an interruption in the pattern. It looks broken. That's what we'd think if we only saw it at this level. But then when you zoom out and you look at the larger pattern, you see that the very thing that seemed to be disfigurement, narrowly considered, is actually an instance of consent or beauty. So that's this idea of beautiful disfigurement. Up close it looks disfigured, but from the perspective of the whole you realize it's beautiful. Here's another example, a little bit more involved. Imagine that you have a painting of a man and a woman. And then imagine that you splatter this painting with black paint and slash it with a knife. And you'd think, well, now you've disfigured the painting. It's no longer an instance of beauty. Now it's disfigurement because the painting's been ruined. And in one sense, that's true. But what if the splattering and the slashing of this image is perceived in light of the fall of humanity and the effect that sin has on human relationships? What if this image of a man and woman splattered with paint and sliced through the middle is actually a statement about the state of humanity under the fall and because of sin? In that sense, the very disfigurement of the image is actually consenting with or agreeing with the larger pattern of reality, namely the brokenness that comes from the fall. And so in that sense, the very disfigurement of this image is what causes it to consent, is what causes it to agree with the overarching pattern of life under the fall. And so in that sense, this disfigurement is a form of consent with reality, a form of beauty. It's an instance of what we are calling beautiful disfigurement. Now, thinking about that brings us to something I want to focus with you on, and that's one of perhaps the supreme gift that the idea of beautiful disfigurement gives to us. When we get this idea, when we understand this concept of beautiful disfigurement, it gives us a gift. And the gift it gives is showing us how beauty transcends boundaries. What I mean is we expect to see beauty in sunny places and happy places and young and healthy places, or majestic and epic and powerful places. That's beauty's wonderful wherever it shows up, but it's not a surprise to see beauty in those places. It seems like that's kind of the province of beauty, that you'd expect to see beauty in a place like that. But instances of disfigured beauty are times where beauty shows up, if we can put it this way, in places where it has no business being. Beauty appears in places where we would never expect to see it. Right in the midst of disfigurement, beauty shows up. And perhaps, arguably, and I will argue this, that is actually where beauty is most at home, in the places where it seems to have no business being. So sometimes we're able to intentionally bring this about. Sometimes we're able to see something disfigured, see something broken, whether it's a vision or a situation in our lives or an experience we're going through or whatever. Sometimes we're able to look at that instance of brokenness and disfigurement and intentionally bring it into relation with a larger pattern and say, no, in relation to this greater pattern, this thing that seems disfigured is actually beautiful. Sometimes by faith, we're able to do that, to bring the disfigured thing into relation with the greater pattern and change our perception from perceiving disfigurement to perceiving beauty. Sometimes that's possible, like we just did with the picture of the slashed couple. But more often than not, when beautiful disfigurement appears, it appears unbidden, in the midst of an instance of brokenness where we aren't even looking for it. We don't even have the strength to look for it. And in the midst of that disfigurement of our life or of our family or of a situation or of a vision, of a picture or something we're seeing, without even looking for it, beauty appears in the midst of that sorrow, in the midst of that fear, in the midst of that dissonance and that loss. It's as if in the dissonance itself, a new harmony arises. It's as if the face of disfigurement becomes the face of beauty. As we're looking at it, this transfiguration takes place, unbidden and as a gift. So let me give you an example of that. Recently, my wife and I and her family were gathered around the deathbed of her grandfather as he was spending his last few hours on earth. And I'm sure many of you have gone through deaths of those that you love, whether peaceful or traumatic. But in any instance, I think an argument can be made that death is the supreme instance of disfigurement. The pain and the sorrow and the brokenness that surrounds it, the deep sense of this not being right, the disjointedness when a person we love is there and no longer there at the same time. Is this them or isn't this them? There's a disfigurement, a deep disfigurement that pierces to our heart in regard to death. And yet, as we sat around our grandfather's deathbed during those last hours, we began to sing some of his favorite hymns. Hymns about the Calvary secured hope that we have in the face of death, singing the truth of the crucified and risen Jesus. And as we sang these true things, right there in the midst of disfigurement, it was as if death bowed down his head and became the standard bearer for beauty. Death was right there in our midst, and death didn't go away. But in that moment, by grace, somehow death himself bowed down and lifted up the banner of beauty. Death carried the banner of beauty in the midst of that situation. And so unbidden, nobody stood up and said, now let's think about how this is actually beautiful in light of this. We didn't say that, but we sang the truth of Christ, and in singing the truth of the slain and risen Jesus, this moment of disfigurement revealed itself to be, in the light of the risen Christ, actually a moment of profound beauty, without ceasing to be disfigurement. That's what's important. It was on the very face of the disfigurement that the beauty appeared. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that beautiful disfigurement is what happens when beauty transcends the expected boundary of the beautiful and appears in the midst of disfigurement. Or to say it another way, beautiful disfigurement is what happens when the seemingly disfigured is graciously gathered up into the pattern of supreme beauty, and so becomes an instance of beauty. While remaining its same disfigured form, it is mercifully, graciously gathered up into the pattern, and so becomes a bearer of beauty as it's woven into the pattern of beauty. Or a biblical way to say it is beautiful disfigurement is what happens when beauty leaves his place at the table and dresses himself for service and kneels down and washes the feet of disfigurement. When beauty condescends, graciously condescends, and embraces disfigurement in love. That's this idea of beautiful disfigurement. It is a transfiguring embrace of disfigurement by beauty, which turns disfigurement into beauty. and reveals beauty in the midst of disfigurement. And I would argue, I hope to argue in the rest of this talk, that beautiful disfigurement is the highest and the supreme instance of all beauty. That beauty appearing in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of disfigurement, is in fact the supreme instance and the highest revelation of beauty that can happen within created reality. Now, arguably, whenever beauty appears within creative reality, it is appearing in the midst of disfigurement because all of reality is broken by the fall. So you could argue that all appearance of beauty is beautiful disfigurement, but that's getting a bit beyond where I want to go today. Let me ask, though, how can I say that beautiful disfigurement is the supreme instance of beauty? How can I be confident that that's true? That's because beautiful disfigurement is enabled by, it's grounded in, it is possible because of, and it is communicative of. It declares, whenever it appears, it declares. So it's grounded in and communicative of the incarnation of beauty itself, which is to say, the crucified and risen Jesus. Beautiful disfigurement is grounded in and communicative of the crucified and risen Jesus, who is himself supreme beauty. And that's where I want to turn now for the rest of our time and think about the beauty of the cross. This is worth and will take lifetimes of enjoyment and study, but I want to just share a few thoughts here. So the cross, when I say the cross, I mean the crucified and risen Jesus, as the supreme instance of beautiful disfigurement, which is to say the supreme instance of beauty in all of reality. How can we say that? A few thoughts. First, what is Christ on the cross? Just think about that. What is Christ on the cross? We could say a lot, but for the sake of our discussion today, I want to explain how and argue that on the cross, Christ is the totality of all disfigurement. On the cross, Christ bears and becomes the totality of all disfigurement in reality. 3 reasons I can say that. First, sin. He becomes sin, 2 Corinthians 5:21, which is to say he bears in himself the sin of his people. But sin, remember, is the opposition to God. Sin is opposition to God. God is supreme beauty. Therefore, sin is the essence of disfigurement. So when Christ becomes sin, when he bears sin in his own body on the cross, he becomes that essence of disfigurement. Consider the most perverse, the most shameful, the most bestial contortion of human action that's imaginable. The fullness of this, Christ bears and becomes on the cross. So on the cross, in bearing our sin, Christ, the eternal Son of God, becomes the totality of disfigurement, the supreme disfigurement. But more than bearing sin, he also, secondly, bears the effects of sin on the cross. All the mental and emotional and spiritual and physical ravages of disease and of sickness, all the wrenching loss of death, all the bitter pangs of sorrow, all the freezing terrors of fear, and the list could go on, all the effects of sin that have poured out like oil into the bones of creation, all of that curse Christ bears in himself on the cross. We will never experience an effect of sin that Christ has not borne the equivalence of in his experience on the cross. So he bears the totality of sin, he bears the totality of the effects of sin, and finally, he bears the totality of the punishment for sin on the cross. The fullness of God's holy wrath against sin is swallowed up and endured by Jesus in his death on the cross. Supreme disintegration, supreme dismantling, supreme deformation, the deformation of humanity that happens under the punishment of God's wrath, Jesus bears in himself on the cross. And so all this to say, on the cross, what is Jesus? He is the totality of creaturely disfigurement. There is no disfigurement of body, mind, soul, spirit. There is no disfigurement that Christ does not bear and become in himself as he bears the sin and the effect of sin and the punishment for sin in his own body on the tree. So, that's the first point. And yet, what do we see when we look at if that was the end of the story, we couldn't consider Calvary without passing out, without vomiting, without being undone. So how is it that Calvary can be sung about every Sunday? How is it that the songs of the throne room of God are filled with the slaughter of the Lamb? How can this totality of disfigurement become the song of the saints and the joy of heaven and the glory of God? How is that possible? Well, think about it this way. When we look at the cross, we look at it only as it is illumined by the resurrection. We perceive the crucified Jesus in truth only as he is illumined in the light of the risen Jesus. And when we do that, what do we see? Well, we see that this one who has become the totality of creaturely disfigurement in his death, in light of his resurrection, we see that this supremely disfigured one is in fact the eternal Son of God, bearing that disfigurement in perfect obedience, in the perfect obedience of love to God and of love to neighbor. We see in light of the resurrection, this isn't just something happening to Christ. This is something he, in sovereign authority, is embracing. And he is embracing this disfigurement in the perfect obedience of love to his Father and love to his neighbor. And therefore, he is bearing this disfigurement in perfect consent or agreement or harmony with God. If he's bearing it in perfect obedience to God, if he's bearing it in perfect love, then he's bearing it in perfect consent, absolute agreement with the Father, perfect conformity to the will of God. Christ bears the totality of disfigurement in perfectly harmonious agreement with the Father. And if that's the case, then he's bearing this disfigurement as perfect revelation of God. Because think, perfect conformity to something is perfect revelation of that thing. If you have a mirror, and I move my hand in front of the mirror, the hand in the mirror perfectly conforms, perfectly agrees or consents to the hand that's moving outside the mirror. And precisely in perfectly consenting with my hand, the hand within the mirror becomes the perfect revelation of my hand. You see how that works? So when Christ bears the totality of disfigurement on the cross, in perfect consent to the Father, he becomes in that act the perfect revelation of the Father. The perfect revelation, the perfect appearance, the perfect declaration of who God is. Which means he becomes in that moment the perfect revelation and declaration and communication of beauty, because God is the supreme beauty. So in bearing all disfigurement in love, in the obedience of love, Christ perfectly conforms to the Father, and so perfectly reveals the Father, which is to say, perfectly reveals beauty. And what this means then is that at the resurrection illumined cross, what we see is supreme disfigurement, born in the redemptive embrace of self-giving love, and so transfigured into the vehicle or the context, or in fact the face of supreme beauty, which is to say God himself. The totality of disfigurement, born in the redemptive embrace of self-giving love, becomes the face of supreme beauty. To use the language of the Bible, the face marred beyond human semblance becomes precisely in that marring, becomes the face in which we see the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. Isaiah 52:13 and following, added together with 2 Corinthians 4:6. The face of the servant, in being marred beyond human semblance through his love, that marred face, that disfigured face, becomes to us the face in which we see the knowledge of the glory, of the beauty of God. Or we could say it again. The Lamb, this is John's imagery, the Lamb in the midst of the throne is the one who bears in his flesh the wounds of his slaughter. Have you thought about that? That at the final vision of Revelation, the Lamb in the midst of the throne, the Lamb who is the radiance of the glory of God and the visual exegesis of the unseen God, the center and the heart of the beatific vision for which all human souls desire. The very center of that vision is the Lamb, and at the very center of the Lamb are the wounds of slaughter. At the center of the beatific vision is the totality of all disfigurement borne witness to in those wounds. At the center of the beatific vision is the totality of all disfigurement born in, overcome through, and so transfigured into beauty by love. That is what's at the center of the vision of God, at the vision of beauty. So, the very heart of beauty, Christ teaches us, is disfigurement, born in love, and so transfigured in that embrace into beauty, which is the revelation of God. That's what we see happen at the cross.